how much of what we're talking about is a human right? How much is there a right? What is the resilience? Let me invite up Mary Robinson and Elisabeth Stern, because for the next 20 minutes we want to engage. You heard from Mary yesterday, who until this year was chair of the elders, and has now moved away and is a very senior figure in the Planetary Guardians, who are very much aligned with Johan Rockström. Elisabeth, you sit in the middle. Oh, all right. And is phenomenally well connected, and particularly as a former Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. And also Elisabeth Stern, who's a board member of the KlimaSeniorinnen. We're going to hear about that in a moment, Elisabeth. But we want to look at the wisdom, the right to a resilient future. And in the next 20 minutes, that's what we want to define before we move on to the next segment of this morning. So welcome, both of you. Mary, we heard from you yesterday, so I'm going to turn to Elisabeth first, although we heard from you right at the end of yesterday, Elisabeth, because many people won't know what KlimaSeniorinnen is. But we need to know what it is, but also this massive case you've been involved in for the last 8 years, underscoring the principles of resilience, which you say are so important.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, the KlimaSeniorinnen, the senior women, Swiss senior women for the protection of the climate, they started as a very small group in some kitchen in Zurich, and they were really frustrated about the climate policy of our country, the emissions, the CO2 emissions, and so on. So they decided to make sure that the country comes up with a better climate policy. And we won that case eventually in April. And since then, we have been on the platform. So what was it about? It's the link between climate protection of climate change is a human right. That was one point. And the other one is climate change or extreme weather conditions due to climate change have a great effect, a negative effect on human health, and specifically that of senior women. Maybe that's for the moment.
And what do you think you've established by the success of your case? It's been a Trojan battle you've had for the last 8 years.
Yes, it was an uphill battle because you have to go through your national courts first before you can end up at the European Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg. So in Switzerland we were dismissed 3 times for reasons that for us were sometimes, to put it mildly, just funny. Yes. Like, for instance, I give you one example. Well, 1.5 degrees global warming hasn't been reached yet. So you cannot complain about your health problem because there is still time to reach that. Now, first of all, we know the trouble we have at 1.2 global warming right now, 1.2. And the limit, according to the Paris Agreement, or what we all as a world community agreed upon with that Paris Agreement, is 1.5 degrees, not to go over that. But we see the trouble we have at 1.2. So then, and another argument was everybody suffers, not just you older women, because at that time there were not that many studies out showing that senior women suffer the most. And so they said everybody suffers, including winter tourism. And then we thought, what? They put the life and sort of life-threatening issues of people actually dying. I mean, some of those climate policies, or we know the high emissions, they actually kill people. So they put that on the same bar with winter tourism.
Let me press you on the point of principle that you've established, the right to life and health under different articles, and also changing the narrative as well.
Yes. So the different articles, probably Mary can say more about that on the human rights side, but Article 2 and 8 are the ones that stipulate the right to life, the right to health. And those are the two articles that we specifically complained about. Okay, what was the other question?
And the
narrative.
The narrative.
Yes.
You've changed the narrative on this.
So you can imagine at the beginning what was the narrative, what do these old folks want anyway, what they complain. They are the boomers, they created all the problem. What is it now? And this has changed over the years. I must say we are receiving a lot of respect now. Some of those old prejudices resurrected itself because the Swiss government is now not adhering to the ruling. But we maybe can talk about that later again.
Well, then, Mary, let's build on what you were saying yesterday and build on what we've just heard from Elisabeth about the right to a resilient future at this time of marking human rights.
Well, first of all, happy International Human Rights Day, everyone, 10th of December. It's nice to be back in Geneva, and it reminds me a special memory. 27 years ago, I was a new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'd taken over in September, and I realized that 1998 was going to be the 50th anniversary. And so I went to South Africa because President, and he was President at the time, Nelson Mandela, agreed that he would help me to launch this 50th anniversary year, and he would also launch the South African Plan of Action for Human Rights. And we did that this day 27 years ago. It seems like another era, doesn't it? But it isn't. The human rights we're talking about are as important today as they were 27 years ago, as they were in 1948.
Are they as under threat?
They are under more threat and different kinds of threat. But we know in the human rights community it's very often a struggle. This is not new. Countries don't always go forward seamlessly. You know, if you look, for example, at women's rights in the United States at the moment, it's really frightening to see what some states are doing. I can't believe it, because in Ireland we have moved forward and we've opened up and we've made progress. We even removed the ban on abortion in our constitution in a referendum, which was very hard to do. But I'm so pleased about this case because, as Elisabeth said, it has established that protection against climate change is a human right, and in particular the health dimensions of that for older women. And, you know, Elisabeth, I want to ask you a question, because I never thought of Switzerland as being a great country for gender equality and gender standing up. And how did these older women, grannies like myself, do it? Tell me.
Well, you're certainly right that we are not a visionary country in terms of gender and women. And you know that we got the vote, the women's vote, very late. So my generation has a lot of practice in practicing patience. Yes. Yeah. So how about we? Yes, you are right. At the beginning, we senior women, we really got the rap. As I said at the beginning, what do they want anyway? But for some reason, at some point it shifted. Some people remembered, specifically the young ones, oh, they could be my grandmother, and my grandmother is actually a nice person. Maybe they are nice. One thing. And the other is that these women were activists all their lives. We have been in the peace movement, the environmental movement, as it was first called. We wanted to rescue all sorts of high plateaus in Switzerland that were meant for the military. We wanted to end hunger within 20 years, so we were never modest. And I think maybe that was the reason. And then when the young activists came on, they just loved us from the very beginning. And we liked them, and we got together. And
Let me encourage anyone else in the next 8 or 9 minutes to come in. So put up your hand and let's get a number to you, because we'd like, if you'd like to engage in what we've heard from Elisabeth and what we're hearing from Mary as well. So put your hand up. Don't leave it too late. Don't back-end load it. There's a hand going up there already. Mary, just picking up on what we've heard there. How much is this, what we've heard from Elisabeth, very frankly, about attitudes here in Switzerland until very recently, how much is that something which is still pervading so much of the world?
I think there is a lot of genuine human rights activism in so many countries. When I served as High Commissioner, when I used to go to the most difficult countries, to Colombia at the time, or Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or whatever, I would come back energized because I would meet people on the ground
And
who
now?
were fighting for the rights. And I think it's still the case. A lot of the the fight of young climate activists is a very human rights one because we do it for climate justice. We see the injustice of climate change. I'm a latecomer to understanding the impacts of climate and human rights together, the connection, because I didn't make any speech about climate during my 7 years as President of Ireland from 1990 to 97. When I was in the UN, another part of the UN was dealing with it. I didn't connect it with my huge portfolio of human rights, gender equality, rights of indigenous peoples, rights of people with disabilities. Didn't make the connection. It was when I worked in Africa afterwards for my small NGO on economic and social rights, and I saw in 2003, 2004, 2005, women saying to me, "Is God punishing us? I don't understand what's happening. The rainy seasons aren't coming, or we've had a long period of drought and then flash flooding. It's destroyed our whole village. It's destroyed the school. What is happening?"
In retrospect, if you, as your time as President of Ireland, how would it have resonated? And we're talking now 20 years ago. How would it have resonated if you had raised it, given what we've just heard about Switzerland?
I think there would have been maybe that's a thing of the future. And that's the difference now. I mean, I wrote a book on climate justice in 2016, and I had to struggle to find examples. The two examples in America were the hurricane, what do you call the hurricane in south of
in New Orleans.
Yes, New Orleans, and also in Alaska, the crumbling of houses and no money in a rich country to help people with the erosion from sea level. And in Europe, it was the Sami people and wonderful Sami women, young climate activists.
In the Arctic Circle.
Now, I wouldn't have any trouble. Look what happened in Spain very recently, the intense flooding, all over it's happening. And that's why this case is so important and that it was seen as a human rights issue.
Let me take that one stage further. We're talking about the right to a resilient future, That means resistant to the enormous risks we're now facing. Actually, is that under threat?
Yeah, the right that is growing and growing, I'm very glad to say, is the right to a healthy environment. It's a right that is increasingly recognized at the national level, in constitutions, in laws. It's also increasingly at regional level, and we're trying to get it fully. It actually has been recognized by the UN General Assembly, the right to a healthy environment. The Strasbourg court just saw it in terms of, as you said, Article 2 and Article 8 on family life, because it's very specific. But the fact that it recognized as a human right was really important.
Let's get a contribution here. Keep it quick, please. Anyone else?
Pavan Sukhdev, Just Impact. Elisabeth, in your case against the Swiss government is the defendant, but I'm wondering, what about the invisible co-defendant, the ones who cause the externalities, which is the emissions of oil and gas companies and agriculture and so on? How does the private sector reflect in your campaign, and will it?
All right, hold that one moment. Over to number 2, please. And there's someone further back. Number 2, let's hear what you want to say.
Hi, I'm Finlay from the Villars Institute. Where do you think we can actually go after this ruling? So how specifically do we keep the momentum going? And secondly, how do we combat nationalist pushback against the ruling of these supranational courts?
Elisabeth.
Well, against the pushback, just keep talking about it. We are still out on the street in every corner of the country talking about the case. And in that sense, creating the space for this implementation, for the implementation of this ruling, which definitely has to happen.
Mary.
May I just come back to something that was said before? There were two things. This human rights issue is debated all over again And the fact is that actually the convention, the European Convention of the Human Rights, was written exactly to include future societal issues. Now, by the way, it even has gone so far with the so-called Maastricht principles, and also one of the court cases in Germany that actually extends the right for a healthy life into the future, for future generations, for future harm. And that I find incredible.
Mary.
Yeah, maybe if I could take the point first of all of the oil and gas companies, the causing of the problem. There have been cases, and I think increasingly those cases will be more important, because one of the problems is to establish causality, and more we're able to do that. We're able to show that it is fossil fuel that's causing the problem. That's important. I think some courts have made the mistake of, when the litigation starts, they start debating the science. They shouldn't do that. The science is clear. It's understood. It's given. It shouldn't be an argument in court. That's a problem. But I think increasingly climate litigation will be important in moving us forward in jerks, if you like. That's what court cases can do.
Let me just hear from number one, please. Go ahead. You've got the microphone.
Hello. Dawn Slevin from ELS Europe. I'm an environmental consultant and have worked in this field for 30 years. And human rights, not one of my personal areas that I worked in, but we have minimum safeguards, highly important. And when I think of human rights, I think of it holistically. I don't put it down to one source. I don't look at climate as being the source of human rights. I look at human behaviour as being the source of human rights. And so when any conversation comes up with it, I have to bring up the topic of what we see happening to the lives of children next door to Europe, in the Middle East, and ask you, how can we not bring this into the conversation? We talk about habitation and the right for health for all people across the world, and this is a global conversation.
Thank you.
And I really feel it's important that we bring this into conversation about what's happening in Gaza, and now in Damascus, and in all of the countries around the Middle East that have been torn apart by international ignoring of this.
In your answer, try and give a message which everyone can take forward as a point of principle from this session.
Yeah. I think your question is really very important, because sadly what is happening is there is not full respect by those countries who talk about being democracies and leading in human rights. They don't in some cases, and this is really serious at the moment, and Gaza is a specific example of it. From the beginning of the terrible attacks by Hamas of the 7th of October of last year, the elders that I'm involved with, we saw a disproportionate response by Israel, and from the beginning called on those countries providing arms to Israel to not provide those arms, to restrain. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and that is a failure, because it's very clear from the laws of those countries they should not provide arms where international humanitarian law is being breached. And then added to that, when the International Criminal Court indicted Putin, the West, particularly the United States, praised and said this was very important. But when Netanyahu and the defense minister were indicted, they tried to rubbish this. This is what is really eroding respect for human rights in a way that I'm very worried about. It's very, very important. And in fact, it's very important in Switzerland that the Swiss government fully respect the Court of Human Rights.
Let's have a final word from Elisabeth. You can see we're time out at the moment. What kind of corner do you believe has been turned with your case, which can be reflected both in Switzerland but also more broadly in Europe and around the world? Quickly, if you can.
Very quickly. I think what really has been turned, that the link between human rights, climate protection, climate change has been established. That's one thing. The second one is states do have a responsibility to protect its citizens from the adverse effects of climate change. That has been very clearly established. I would so much like to ask Mary a question which goes in another direction. Do I have time for that, Nick?
Probably not, but we won't tell anyone. The clock
Mary
has
is
stopped.
something I always wanted to know, and it came up with this whole financial sector discussion that, in my view, is just moving so terribly slowly and everybody feels they are restrained. What is actually the degree of free decision you could take when you were a president or in any sort of a really leadership function? How much do you have to follow what is given, even higher up, or how much do you have to actually act freely?
Mary, you're among friends here, so you can be honest.
Actually, you don't have as much freedom to act as you think you would like to have, but it needs collective standing up by leaders. I think we're in a perilous moment at the moment where the country that was seen as being the champion of democracy and human rights is now denying the science and, under the prospective, rather aggressive leadership that President Trump is promising the world, that is scaring CEOs, I know, making them scared about ESG, about DEI. We need to stand up for our human rights. What is the alternative? What is the alternative? It is the triumph of greed and the bullying of the big boys in our world. It's more important than ever that we understand the value of what was created, the whole structures that have been created that are so, so important. International rule of law, international protection of human rights. And it's because we want to protect from what is happening. And, there is an inhumanity in what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in Sudan, which is the biggest case of civilians being killed or suffering severe famine in Sudan. We don't even talk about it. So we really need to re-energize, and let's use this International Human Rights Day to reflect on how important it has been, what we have built up over the years. And let's talk more about climate justice. Let's talk more about the link between the injustice of climate, the injustice that affects the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples much earlier and much more severely, that within that there's a real gender dimension, and then the injustice to nature. I really appreciate that there is more interest now in addressing the importance of regenerating and protecting nature from what is happening. And, I'm part of the Guardians, as you mentioned, Nick, that Johan Rockström spoke about, his health check. We are in a perilous moment, and we need to stand up and understand that the greatest achievement has been international human rights, international rule of law, multilateral agreements, even if they don't reach the state we'd like. Those agreements are important because they move us forward. And we've got to re-energize ourselves and stand up for these issues.
I'm very reluctant to have to bring this to a close, but thank you both very much indeed for laying out so clearly and so vividly some very important points of principle. So thank you both very much indeed. And I'm going to invite Raj Kumar, who's founder and president of DevEx, to come up here, because we want to move forward on how finance is driving the sustainability agenda. Raj. Thank you. Well done.